if you could. And the recordings will be available on the FCI website. This is a joint meeting. I think it's the 7th or 8th SIG Special Interest Group faculty meeting, and we've been running the national CSO meeting probably for the last 10 years. Can you believe it? So it's a joint meeting between those two groups. We're trying to bring those two organisations or two groups of individuals together for better networking. Do go on mute, as I mentioned, and we'll be using the chat function for questions. We'll hold your questions until the kind of end of the presentation. I might bring you in verbally if we can do that, but we're going to try and theme some of the questions that are coming through, and we like to try and bring you into the call if possible. So we're going to make a slow start. I'm going to ask each speaker to introduce themselves rather than me getting all the qualifications wrong. So, but I'd just like to say thanks very much to the speakers for doing the preparation on the talks today. A lot of work always pulling these presentations together, but in particular, special thanks to Sean White, who I work with closely. Let him introduce himself and then go straight into the presentation. I may have forgotten something. Jan, have I forgotten something? I would normally forget something vital.
No, you haven't forgotten anything.
No. Good. Let's change. Thanks. Sean, can I bring you in just a brief intro, saying who you are, because I know most of us know you, but others may not. Sean, over to you.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Sean White, a Principal Safety Engineer within the Clinical Safety team at NHS Digital. So work with Sebastian on central assurance services, but also doing some strategic research work around AI and what that means in terms of clinical safety and how we best and safely optimize the technology. Thank you.
We'll just hit Sean to share screens and then go into the first presentation.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So the observant amongst us may, and those familiar with the standards may spot that my name's on the front of them. So the DCBs are things quite close to my heart. But what I'm talking to you about today is, or trying to clarify, when the standards apply in the context of the work that we do. So it can be difficult understanding the applicability of the standards. Technology is obviously becoming more complex, more sophisticated, and we're seeing an increasing number of queries coming into our team asking for clarification. So motivated me to do some work to draw up this guidance to make sure that as a domain we're consistent in our interpretation of what the law establishes, and that we adhere to the standards as is appropriate. Don't worry about this flow diagram. I'm going to talk through each of the decision points in a bit more detail. So the start of the journey really is understanding the legal position, the law that exists that brings into scope not just the DCBs but information standards in general. So the Health and Social Care Act 2012 section 250 specifically establishes the legal context for consideration of the DCBs. These two key definitions here are key. If we as an organisation align with those definitions, providing adult social care or care services in England, then we fall within the scope of the standards. An important thing to think about, though, is the intended use of a product. So as a manufacturer, you may say, well, I'm using private money to develop this product. But if your intention is to sell that into the NHS, then you fall within scope of the legal requirement, and it makes obvious sense to adopt and adhere to the standards as soon as is practicable in the development of your product. Regardless of the legal position, the position of NHSD is that they strongly recommend that these standards are adopted whenever digital products are being used for care or social purposes. Why would we not want to conduct effective clinical risk management? Why would we want to ignore best practice? So that's establishes the legal context. If we move to the next slide, we now need to think about the care context, and we've touched upon that on the previous slide. So essentially, if we're providing health or adult social care services and products, then the standards apply. Generally speaking, well-being lifestyle apps are out of scope of the standards because they're not direct health or social care services. So I've cited an example here, Brush DJ. It's a very simple app. It lets a user select a soundtrack with the idea it'll encourage them to brush their teeth for long enough. But again, we need to think broader than just the immediate impact. We need to think about, well, can this well-being, can this lifestyle app have indirect health or social care impact? And again, NHSD's position is that we would recommend that the standards are adopted when developing these products. Moving to the next slide, again, we're thinking about the health purpose. So is the product influencing, directing, helping us to deliver real-time or near real-time direct care? Clearly, if that is the case, the standards apply. When we think about population health type products, and generally they fall out of scope, so regional reporting tools, secondary uses, generally they fall out of scope. But again, we need to think a bit more broader. Could there be any impact on perhaps local care commissioning decisions? And again, NHS Digital would recommend that the standards are adopted in those scenarios as well. So we've got to a point in this flow where we've established that we're in scope of the legislation, we're in scope of the standards. As a manufacturer, we've also got an obligation to think about the medical device regulations. Specifically in the UK, we're working to MDR 2002. They provide a definition of what a medical device is. I'm not going to talk about that today. But it's relatively clear and straightforward. Another point of note really is that following Brexit, the UK is following a different regulatory framework. If we can categorise our product as not being a medical device, then the limit of our responsibility is compliance with DCB 129 as a manufacturer and DCB 160 as a deployment organisation. Conversely, if we establish that our product is a medical device, then obviously we've got our commitments under that regulatory framework, and we must address the requirements associated with that product, which in turn are based on the risk classification of that product. So if we move to the next slide, we're in a position of where we're thinking about our product as being a medical device. Now we've committed to the DCB requirements, but we now need to think about how the medical device is implemented. So if the medical device is a standalone product, i.e. it achieves its function without any further integration, interdependency on any other product, then that's as much work that needs to be done. Medical device regulations need to be adhered to. So if we think about a piece of software that is running a drug dosing algorithm, if that is embedded within the infusion pump itself, that's classed as standalone software, and the DCBs aren't applicable in that case. If, however, the medical device is implemented in general purpose IT or another system, for example, then we've got to think about the requirements of DCB 129 and 160. So thinking about National Early Warning Score calculator, for example, if that's provided in an EPR, then that element of the EPR must also be considered in our 129 obligations. What we don't want to do is create a lot of duplicate work. Hopefully people recognise that the risk management regimes in both medical device regulations and the DCBs are very similar. So manufacturers need to think about how they can satisfy the requirements of both regimes with a common evidence base. So we're now coming to the end of the process flow, and the last decision point is really from a perspective of a user organisation. If we've established that the medical device is a standalone device, then as far as I understand, there are no further regulations or requirements associated with the deployment and use of that standalone medical device. However, if the medical device is integrated with other products or other elements of infrastructure within an organisation, it's a recommendation of NHS Digital that users adopt ISO 80001-1. This was recently reissued in the summer of last year, and it is a risk management standard. It's broader than the DCBs in that it also considers security risks and, to a lesser extent, effectiveness of the technology. So if we think about our infusion pump, but we've got an architecture where the dosing algorithm is external to the pump itself, it's implemented as part of a wider prescribing and medicine administration system, then the recommendation from NHSD is that the risk associated with that integration is managed through ISO 80001-1. The status of 8001-1, it's an international standard. There's a cost associated with buying it, and at the moment the NHS don't mandate it. Whether that changes over time, we will see. But as things stand, it's not a mandated NHS standard. So just in conclusion, really, I think we can all appreciate understanding the regulation can be a bit problematic. Hopefully the process that's been developed, and particularly the guidance document that we've written and which is about to be published on our website, will help. Important thing is it will give us a baseline from which people can make a decision as to what regulation applies in their particular case, and also explain the rationale for that decision. It's also important to understand what NHS's digital remit is in this space. So outside of national contracts, national requirements, NHS Digital doesn't have any jurisdiction, and we cannot and we will not provide advice on a case-by-case basis. We don't necessarily understand the full context. We don't necessarily understand the detail of the deployment, the detail of the clinical use. So going forward, NHS Digital isn't going to advise on the applicability of the standards. We will refer out to the guidance and leave it to organisations to draw their own conclusions and justify those conclusions. People that are familiar with 14971, which is the harmonised risk management standard associated with medical devices, with our DCBs and H1001, will recognise that the fundamental risk management processes are fundamentally comparable. That's not happened by chance. The DCBs and 8001 were purposefully designed to reflect the principles of 14971. DCBs are structured significantly different, but the fundamental principles align. ISO 80001 again aligns very closely to DCB 160, and that's because we led the development work and the rewrite of that standard, and we purposefully developed it to be as close as to DBC 160 as we could. I think the other point to recognise is that we are in a state of flux at the minute following Brexit, particularly in the context of medical devices. MHRA are doing a lot of work at the moment, looking at software, looking at AI, what that means in terms of medical device regulation. So I would encourage you, if you've not already done so, to have a look at their change programme. There's a lot of useful information in there. And my understanding is that the new regulation, the new guidance will be in place next summer. DCB 0160, perhaps given what I've just described, there's an opportunity for that to be superseded by 80001, or perhaps point out to that going forward, but further discussion is needed in that space. So that really concludes what I had to say. Thank you for your time. I'm not sure how much time we've got for questions. Happy to take any. Also happy for people to contact me or the team on those email addresses. Just be mindful, though, as I've said before, don't ask for us to give a position on a particular use case. We can't be doing that going forward.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. You can hear me, I hope.
Yes, loud and clear.
Echo your end, I think. So there was a question just, Sean, on the DTAC. So we didn't mention DTAC at all, which is a question from Barbara. We are trying to bring DTAC framework into our organisation and some regional programmes with the emergence of the ICSs. Do you have some recommendations about implementation? That was from Barbara, who's just appeared on screen, Barbara. So any comments about DTAC and where that sits, Sean?
So hopefully you appreciate that DTAC has been established by what was NHSX. That was largely done independently of NHS Digital. In principle, it's a very good idea, and it's certainly driving up awareness with respect to the standards and clinical risk management. It's far from perfect, but the key thing for me is that if I'm a manufacturer, then it's providing clarity in terms of what I need to do, i.e. look at DCB, work in accordance with DCB. And similarly from a commissioning organisation, hopefully it's giving some guidance as to what you should be looking for from your manufacturers. At the moment, it's not, as I understand, an accredited scheme, so there's no sort of formal regulatory need or certification associated with it. Again, whether that changes going forward, I'm not sure, because I don't work that closely with the DTAC.
Thanks, Sean. There are some general questions around international standards and international suppliers. Now, I suppose just a kind of commentary, as we all know, there are many international suppliers out there who may not be aware of our standards, and someone's asking, can we point them towards our team? This is your team, Sean, our team, for advice.
Certainly point them to the clinical safety team. We will point them out to this guidance. As I said in the presentation, we've experienced a considerable and unmanageable amount of requests for us to give people a position on the applicability of the standards. We can't do that going forward. It's not in our jurisdiction. We can stand up the guidance to help them and help them draw a conclusion. And again, use of the DTAC should raise awareness outside of, normal markets as well.
Okay. Jonathan had a question. I'm going to bring you in, Jonathan. Do you want to ask a question? You've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, just on the side of, about DTAC, I've found anecdotally that suppliers have actually been quite receptive to it. It seems quite simple for them to follow and been quite happy to fill in that, and it's obviously helps all the other things, interoperability, etc. And yeah, but I was just wondering where the CE mark comes in. So the European conformity, I know we're still using it in the UK, because that sort of gave a sense that all the regulations, including the ISO, were held. Am I right in saying that about the CE mark? Yeah,
so the CE mark, which has been so I can't get the words out, superseded by the CA mark in England, that persists in the context of a product if it is a medical device. Not all products are necessarily medical devices, effectively there's the two regimes. There's that associated with the formal regulations run by MHRA and the compliance with DCB, and there are areas where it overlaps, like in the example I talked through in the presentation. But yeah, just because a product has got a CE or a CA mark doesn't necessarily mean that they're fully compliant with the DCBs. There are areas of difference. The role of a CSO, for example, doesn't persist in the regulatory space. The concept of a safety case is different to a technical report. So there are succinct differences, and again, I'm doing some work to advise what those are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks. Maggie?
Hi, thank you, Sean. I've been monitoring the chat and sort of trying to pull together some themes around this. I think it is very helpful that NHS Digital is saying, even if it doesn't apply, you should probably be thinking of applying it, which is a really, really good and a professional sort of clinical way of thinking. One of the first things that came up, not the international piece, is the DCBs only cover England, not the UK. So we need to be thinking about this. But I suppose what I was thinking, you take the view, Sean, you're very authoritative about the ISO standards. Those of us in this job, most of us are doing this part-time as part of another job. I'm not, but most people are. Don't understand the standards at all. My experience in DTAC is manufacturers will try and play us off, saying we don't need to do DCB because we've done this ISO standard, which in the DTAC arena, we have taken that view that doesn't count, because actually we need you to hand over a clinical safety case report that we can understand. So I think that was a really helpful thing. I think there's more work to be done in unpicking and making it applicable to those of us and my colleagues who are doing this as part of another clinical job, to know what they should be doing, shouldn't be doing, and to be able to hold their nerve and say, I need this from you, manufacturer. There's a few other things that come up, but I wonder if we could sort of deal with that ISO DCB overlap, plus or minus, and how we address it in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales.
Yeah, before you do answer, I'm going to bring Paul in.
Yes.
Campbell. Is this a similar theme, Paul, you want to ask?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sebastian. I suppose it is my understanding. We've looked at this. I've taken a product through the safety approach, effectively a product that's gone through the UKCA approach, and the truth is we have to use ISO 14971, the latest version of that, and that is the clinical risk management tool that applies legally. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. The legal basis is that you must do something consistent with a standard such as ISO 14971. So then when you comply with that standard, you have complied with the legal requirements. So we've had to do that. And in truth, my understanding, and that's the connected harmonized standard. So for that application, if I had said we've done the DCB standard, that wouldn't have covered us legally, or at the very least, we would have then had to try to say how that matches ISO 14971, which we've gone through that. That, to my mind and to our experience, is a clinical safety case, fully compliant. And having done the CSO training from NHS Digital and looked at and previously used the DCB standards, we see that as the new way forward. And that's what we're doing, because that's what we've had to do for a UKCA approval. And you're quite right, the DCB standards is not, we're very jealous that that's part of your legislation in England, because it really enforces something, but it's not a legal basis here, whereas the UKCA mark and the harmonised ISO standards are.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a slight distinction though, isn't there? Because there are products that don't constitute a medical device, and that was the original motivation for standing up the DCBs, or DSCNs as they were back in 2009, to address that gap between products that go through a process of legal regulation, compliance with harmonised standards, and that didn't, but still had or potentially represented a clinical risk. So that was the motivation for standing up the standards. There is a lot of comparison between 14971 and the DCBs. If you go back and look at the original DSCNs, you probably work out that the word medical device was changed to health IT. They were almost the carbon copy. Obviously, the DCBs look different now, but it is important that organisations recognise this, and where there is a dual requirement, that they optimise, like I say, the evidence base, the work that they do to align with both. And one of the next pieces of work I'm doing, which we're realising through some research we're doing, is going to stand up some guidance to say, well, requirements X, Y, and Z align with, in the DCBs, align with requirements X, Y, and Z in the medical devices, and just identify where there are gaps, because there are differences. The 14971 talks in broader risk terms. It has this concept of hazardous situation, which is useful. It talks about consideration of cumulative risk, whereas the DCBs don't. The DCBs stand up the requirement for a CSO, a safety case, a hazard log, and things like that. But yeah, I'm not sure I answered the specific questions,
No.
but
Okay. Thanks, Sean. Just a kind of general question. DTAC, who's managing that now? There is a process in place, as I understand, still for DTAC management and checking of DTAC submissions. So I don't. Was that Brendan who asked the question there?
That's still sitting with. They're still sitting. NHSX is still.
Yes.
Commissioning SCW to do some. I'm never quite certain what the threshold is for that. There are certain ones we're having to do that coming on the digital playbook and things that are being commissioned by NHS England. So I think the idea is if you're doing it at a trust level, you should be doing it yourself. But these ones that are coming in at that sort of central level are being done by. So anybody? I don't think Rex on the call.
I've got so I'm going to just bring in Brendan, and then we're going to slowly close this session. So Brendan.
Thanks, Sebastian. I suppose that just speaking with Northern Ireland accent from Scotland, or working in Scotland, or working remotely from Northern Ireland. Just keep us all honest. The faculty is a 4-country body. DTAC is England specific again. So when Paul and I and other colleagues, and Laura is also on the call with us from my team in Scotland, we were looking at this, and we're looking at the DCB standards, and we're all trained in the DCB standards. We thought that's really good practice. And although it doesn't apply in Scotland legally, we're going, well, we're clinicians, we can't ignore that good practice we're seeing in England. So we're looking at, well, let's get under the bonnet of where the DCB standards came from. And that was an older version of 14971. So we've adopted in Scotland is looking at, and we're pushing Scottish government to make it again a legal requirement. But we have got it into our refreshed digital strategy. So we're looking at the updated version of 14971 is the deep dive on how you do risk management. And our view is that applies whether it's a medical device or just health IT. And I think with new legislation coming, more is going to tip into that kind of medical device territory. And once you're in medical device, then the regulations are very toothy, and there's a lot more you have to do. But we make the argument that all health IT can lead to patient harm, and therefore we want to adopt these standards. And from a faculty point of view, what it became to push is that we stick with the ISO standards because they apply across all 4 countries, and they're compatible with the DCB standards because that's where the DCB standards come from. But if we talk about the ISO standards, so 81001 for those who aren't familiar with it, and it is a barrier. Paul's trying to solve it for us in Scotland in terms of how we get access to these. Are a couple £100 a pop to get access to some of these BSI standards, and that's clearly a barrier to entry. 81001 gives you a nice overarching compliance framework because it includes clinical safety, the data flows, the IG, the cybersecurity. But within that, you'll reference in, well, how do you do risk management? And that's 14971, and should be running a quality management system. That's ISO 13485. So there's a family of these standards. But if anyone who's actually got over the barrier of buying some of these standards and read them, they are, let's say, bedtime reading. They'll put you to sleep very quickly. So what we're trying to develop in Scotland is a playbook to do these, which I suppose is where the DTAC thing's coming from. Is kind of how do you turn these into something pragmatic that teams can take. And I suppose my final comment before I hand it back to you is we have similar challenges in Scotland in terms of Paul and Laura and I are all in a national team and a national board, so a bit like NHS Digital, but we have that challenge then. Well, how do all our territorial boards, as they're called in Scotland, do this at an individual level? And we're trying to get to a kind of hub and spoke model where we build a team in the centre that we can then supplement by local staff and territorial boards. 81001 calls out something very important, and that's that this is a team sport, and you involve the right team from the outset, and that's really important.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brendan. I'm just going to bring in just Maggie and then Clive, if I could, and maybe some other hands up. Maggie,
I just want to challenge this because I'm sure there's other people on the call. I've learned over the years that I have to stick up and answer difficult questions. Most of the time, I haven't had a clue what you're talking about, Brendan and Sean and Paul, because actually I'm a clinician and I'm interested in the quality and how I make it work. I do know, and I'm not being disrespectful to you, but we do need to demystify this. And I will point out that whatever standard trumps anything else, in DTAC, we weren't having it. We were saying we want that 0129 because the 0129 requires a clinical safety case report, which is simple to understand by the end user. And that is what we are looking for. So the legality is wonderful, but saying somebody's passed or failed something is neither here nor there if those of us who are using it do not understand what that means. So what I would like to do, and I'm sorry, I'm being a bit pushy because I am, but what I would like to do is unpick these and map it out for those of us who are doing this, where we are not coming from a governance perspective, we're coming from a clinical perspective, and we want to make it work in the work we do. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Maggie. We'll take it away.
If I might just come back on that, just
please do, Brendan. Please,
I appreciate your purposely trying to sort of be a bit provocative in that, Maggie. So absolutely. So where we're coming from is the DCB standards don't just give you a safety report. That safety report is only valid at the point in time you press print. What it actually gives you is a technical file, which is all the evidence base of why it's safe, and it's that whole process of making sure
absolutely.
It's the report. So, but that's what you want to get to, is that kind of you have all the evidence that you can stand over from the point of view that's what you need to do. So, but I agree, and this is why I give England a lot of credit in the sense of we're looking at what's been happening in English and made that. I would say do as England say, not as England do, because I totally agree. It's not appropriate for somebody who's already very busy to say, by and large, you didn't step back quickly enough. You're now the clinical safety officer for a large trust. and you're going to do this on top of everything else you're already doing. This does require time. It is not straightforward.
It does.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm going to bring in Clive and then Paul, and then we're going to close. Clive.
Yeah, sorry, Sebastian, I just wanted to make one point. I think Alicia had mentioned it earlier on in the chat, was Sean, great to the point. Yeah, all very exciting. I'm just concerned and have some anxiety that the concept of culture hasn't been one of those component parts that fits into that. I mean, it's all very well, hey, I have a car outside with all the certificates that you could throw at it, but I mean, it's up to me to drive it safely and accept and understand how that works. So it's just a plug really for, this is all very well, but if you can't bring people with you, and Maggie's used the language about, this is all very well, but difficult to understand. If it's not simplified and if it's not communicated and understood by the people who are involved in it, then we will fall short of that mark. That's just an observation.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, there's a balance to be drawn, isn't there, in terms of the standard, being able to demonstrate you've met compliance with it. So the standard has to be structured, the requirements have to be testable and evidence, but then we need to be able to translate what does that mean on a day-to-day basis for those people doing the work.
And Sean, I understand that, and the analogy I'm going to give you, God forbid this is being recorded, but when I was a young man, when my car needed an MOT, I just borrowed someone's tires for the day, spun them off, spun them back on, and carried on as normal. So whilst one made the cut on the day, from a culture perspective, and I'm going back, I was very young. Clearly, I didn't get it.
Okay, thanks, Clive, for that insight. I'll keep my car safe when I next come around. Paul, finally.
Yeah, no, and I agree with the points. So the world software is now everywhere and can actually do more harm as well as it can do good now, and that's only going to become more of an issue. So anything that improves the culture, the approach, the safety, trying to get some standards and some process around it in a complex world is a helpful thing to do. DCB was ahead of its game on that basis and absolutely is there, and DTAC is part of that. So all these things are good. One thing I do think, and I agree, Maggie, with your point that having a written report for someone to read, it's a sort of interpretable type without being an expert in the ISO standards is a helpful thing. I wouldn't disagree with that. In fact, when we did the sort of ISO 14971, we then completed it by writing that narrative report based on it. However, the bones of what goes into that, the assessment of the risk, comes from 14971. And one thing I do think is important for anyone who's listening about international or any businesses and colleagues out there, I've been involved in the faculty the whole time. I think there's an important message. The faculty should be clear about this. If we're talking to developers and manufacturers, if it is software as a medical device, then you have to comply with the current harmonized standards. Full stop, end of story. Otherwise, it will not. You could say, but we've got DTAC and we've got DCB, but that's actually not the current harmonized standards for something that's legally qualified as a medical device. So I think it's a really important point. There's nothing wrong with DCB. There's nothing wrong with the culture and the approach and the clinical safety reports, but it would be wrong of us to give advice to someone about a legal position for a qualified medical device that's not factually correct. I sit on the expert advisory panel for the MHRA, and I've been in front of the MHRA where we've gone wrong, and I'm now on the MHRA where we're going right. So I'm pretty clear. I know the legislation on this, and I think that as a faculty, we've got me, I'm not of international customers, it'd be wrong of us to not be very clear about that official legal position. Happy to be challenged on that by anyone.
Sean?
Exactly right, Paul. There is a significant distinction. The regulations around medical devices are obviously a lot more stringent, and there are no lets on it. If your product is a medical device is tightly defined within the regulations. You have to adhere to those regulations. Your medical device could be implemented in general purpose software, and there is an additional ask to consider those other elements of 129 as well because of that integration.
Okay. So thanks very much, Sean. that. And I know we haven't answered all the questions, but I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. And just, Sean, thanks very much for the presentation. We're going to let you off the hook now.
Okay.
Like quiz time. But thanks seriously for pulling that presentation together. And thanks for all those questions coming in. But sorry, we haven't been able to answer them all. But we do, Jan, we do keep capture the chat as well, don't we? Yeah, you're on mute, Jan. Yeah, we do.
Oh, yes, we do. I mean,
and
we could perhaps respond to ones that we haven't been able to answer today, if people would like to put them up in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. And just to say that Sean will be happy to share his slide deck. He may modify it slightly, and they will be circulated. Okay. So thanks again to Sean. We're going to move on. We're out of time again. I'm going to just let Maggie introduce herself and then Clive when he speaks. But Maggie, can I hand over to you for the next section? And this is a common question coming through to us, not only in NHS Digital, but also for the faculty. What about insurance for the CSOs? So we thought this would be useful just to put on just for some discussion points. Maggie, I'll let you introduce yourself. Thank you very much. And over to you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I think most people know me. She says, because I'm notorious. So I'm Maggie Lay. I, until very recently, worked for South Central West Commissioning Support Unit and found myself, as I think Paul or Brendan said, I didn't step back quickly enough when I found myself uniquely qualified for being the CSO in a Commissioning Support Unit. I am unashamedly a supporter, not a supporter, I'm unashamedly aligned myself with the 0160, the deployment and use, because I think that's a transformational tool and gives us something to help improve lives for our patients and our clinical colleagues. So I'm on the the steering group of the Clinical Safety SIG. So what we've done is produced some slides in response to a question that was submitted to Jan from one of the members of the faculty. Let me just get this going. So the question was, and I've sort of paraphrased it a bit. Professional personal indemnity insurance relating to our work as clinical informaticians, particularly in clinical safety. So this is interesting. It's not just clinical safety, but clinical safety, I think, is the most pertinent. I think if we get this right, we've probably got it right for everybody else. Is a bit of an unknown entity. We have recently been discussing who may be able to provide this, and if they truly understand the extent of the work we undertake as clinical informaticians. I know we'll be covered to a certain extent by employer, but there is an appetite for personal cover. So the question was, do we have any advice regarding indemnity insurance, and will they consider offering this as a service? So what we did, this is the response is, with the action was that we revisited the standards for some advice. We developed some initial guidance. We drew on our own experiences, and we produced these slides based on our experiences. So from my perspective as employed by a CSU, and from Clive's perspective as a direct contractor freelancer. The plan, and we will revisit this at the end of the slideshow, is that we will continue this discussion with the SIG and concentrate on experience and trust and similar, because we're very much aware that although both of us have worked across a wide variety of things, and I could be argued to be directly employed, there's still a difference. So we need to look at that in more detail. We probably want to align with the professional standards SIG. We want to develop and maintain discussion forums, resources and guidance. We would like to develop and publish FCI positions on matters such as these, so we become the voice of the faculty of clinical safety from the faculty perspective, and then explore options for endorsing insurance provision for members. So we haven't got very far with that, but we certainly want to do that, and we have some ideas, but we will revisit this and ask for other people's comments at the end of the slideshow. So first of all, we looked at the standards, and these are the ones that I picked out. The top management responsibilities: it must make available sufficient resources. So probably needs to be more than 1.2, 2.5 of you a week. Must assign competent personnel and must nominate a clinical safety officer. It's not down, so it's not the clinical safety officer alone, it's competent personnel and the clinical safety officer. And it must authorise the deployment. health IT system. And a clinical safety officer must be a suitably qualified and experienced clinician. Bit vague, but there's something in there. Must hold current registration, must be knowledgeable in risk management, and must make sure that the process defined by the clinical risk management process are followed. Okay, so this is my highlighting. In terms of the insurance piece, there's all kinds of other discussions to be had out of these two items. But top management must authorize. They authorize. Okay, so we are not top management. We do not authorize. We discuss and we examine and whatever we come to conclusions, but we do not authorize. So what we've done, and we were going to be publishing this, but we've all got a little bit behind ourselves. But this is where we came up to on the steering committee of the SIG. Where this is our current position guidance. We can't quite decide what we're going to call it because it's not black and white. But this is sort of emerging through people's thinking. So risk ownership, it's a board level responsibility. The standards refer to top management, but we understand this as board. So somebody who has an executive responsibility, and we believe this will be covered by corporate insurance, which is what the questionnaire implied. Then we thought about assurance accountability. This is not the same as risk ownership. So what we're trying to get to here is that as a clinical safety officer, you do not have to have insurance for the ownership of that risk. This is all a little bit sort of vague, and I'm not really an insurance expert, but this is what we've got to. It's about ensuring that you've undertaken your assurance responsibilities in a professional way. So that's the same as you being a professional in everything else you do. It's just that clinical safety hasn't really been well defined. So we're in a little bit of a grey area at the moment. We have identified two scenarios. One, the employee accountability, and where a CSO is employed by an organisation, they should be covered by the organisation's corporate insurance. And CSO responsibility should be made clear in the CSO job description, and the relevant terms of reference for assurance groups. And then with the contractor accountability, it's the contractor's responsibility to insure themselves. So that's a huge lot of stuff in two very short statements. The last bit is about professional accountability. Of course, you have to follow the code of conduct for your clinical profession, as in any other clinical employment. So what we've got is this sort of Venn diagram that's emerging. There's a little bit of professional accountability. There's a little bit about risk ownership. There's a little bit about the profession of being a CSO, which sits under the wing of whatever clinical profession you're in. So it's a little bit difficult to work out, but we need to unpick it and come to a position ourselves. Sorry. So one of the things I just wanted to highlight a bit about this again, I'll go back and talk about it again, or we'll pick it up. But it is absolutely, if somebody has employed you to be a clinical safety officer, they must have given you a job description. If they haven't, then that is their responsibility. Okay, so I know this is really hard, and I'm not going to ask people to go and create waves in their trusts, but I think we need to be working towards this position. Is if you are directly employed, I don't think you have to have any more liability than you do as a clinician in your other role. That's my position, and I think we need to explore this further with other bodies. So we'll come back to it again. Sorry, rules of engagement. So what I've come up with, and I did this before this question came up. This is about my relationship in SEW, being asked to take on work, and from bitter experience, these are the standards that I've sort of come up with. Is that, and that's sort of the customer, that's the terminology used in CSUs. So the rules of engagement are the customers must understand this as an assurance role, not a delivery or risk ownership role. So I don't own the risk, I can't make anything happen, and I'm not delivering the change, okay, unless they employ me to do that as well. The project will have a clear governance structure, making it clear who is accountable for risks and decisions, and there should be a clinical risk management system in place which covers the project or programme, and establishing the clinical risk management system will be a separate and strategic piece of work. Okay, so if I have to go in, there's not one in place, I would have to say, okay, do you want to help me? Do you want me to help you put one in place? It must be clear on whose behalf the CSO is acting. If you're in a trust, that may be a little bit, you sort of think when it's obvious. If you're working in CCG land or CSU or working as a freelance contractor, you must understand on whose behalf they're acting. Is it primary care? Is it a specific trust or more than one trust? Is it an informal group of organisations, which largely it has been for me for the past 10 years, which is a bit vague? Or a formal group of organisations, which is what we hope ICSs will become. And there must be board level representation of the group or groups on whose behalf the CSO is acting, which will make decisions based on the recommendations within the clinical safety case report. So the CSO's role, if you read the standards, is to approve the clinical risk management plan and to approve the clinical safety case report and the hazard log. But the project or programme will schedule the clinical risk management activities as agreed in the plan. The CSO must be given access to the clinical risk management folder for the programme. And the CSO, this is my personal pain here, will not be expected to create, lead or administer clinical assurance groups. The CSO, you might as a person be asked to do that, but the CSO does not necessarily do that. It's not part of their job description. They are required to approve the clinical risk management plan and the clinical safety case report. So once again, there must be board level representation of the group or groups on whose behalf the CSO is acting. My feeling is that's the CCIO. It probably isn't, but the CCIO must have somebody on the board they can account to. You, as in an assurance role, are not making decisions on behalf of the organisation. That's my bottom line. That's what I'm saying. So, rant over. Sorry, I have got laryngitis at the moment. I'm going to hand over to Clive, who's going to pick up his piece of work and go into more detail about what it's like to be a contractor. It picks up the same thing, the same things recur and recur and recur. It's about it's assuring that things won't happen rather than ensuring against them actually happening. But there we go. Paul, sorry. Clive, do you want me to drive for you?
No, yeah? Please. Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Clive, do you want to do a quick intro, Clive, as well?
Of course, yeah. So I'm Clive Tomsett. Some of you know me. I'm essentially a clinical safety officer. I'm predominantly working in the freelance contractor space. So, I take commissions from large organisations implementing EPRs right down to small vendor startups. So as a contractor, I just thought to promote this issue around insurance was to give some definitions and some experience that might just help contextualise it. The reason for doing that is many of you might be employed either full-time or part-time in trusts or within the NHS, but perhaps at some time in your career, for whatever reason, you might want to venture into the area of providing contractor clinical safety officer services. So the following slides are really from my own experience of, in some cases, having actually got it wrong and just providing the opportunity about learning from those experiences. Thank you, Maggie. So perhaps the first place to start as a contractor is just to undermine the significance and importance of making sure that you actually are insured, and that in obtaining that insurance, you understand what the component parts that inform that insurance. So basically, as a contractor providing clinical safety officer services, the insurance I have and the insurance that is generally offered forms into three component parts. So you have the public liability, which is not dissimilar to you painting the outside of your house and falling off your ladder and falling into the next door neighbour's garden and smashing their window. So that's a classic public liability insurance. You then have the professional indemnity element, and importantly, the product liability insurance. And what I'll do is I'll pick up on some of those themes. I make the point here that buyer beware. Please do not just take the insurance that's offered you. Do have a look at some of the terms and conditions. And generally your clients as a contractor will look for £1 million worth of indemnity in each of those component areas. But in some cases, depending on the risk aversion or indeed the complexity of the product that you might be working on, some clients might require you to have up to £5 million worth of cover. So again, you're going to pay premium costs based on the degree of cover. So I make that point. Thank you, Maggie. just looking at some of these areas, just as I mentioned, public liability, generally concerned with damage to property and injury, and essentially importantly is paying for the costs that you might need if you need professional representation in any lawsuit. Now, interestingly, not only bought by the client, but also think about digital health technology, and it might be that the patient or group of patients affected by any assertion that the technology does not do what it says on the tin might look to claim against the client, who in turn might wish to recover those costs from you. So again, important things to consider, public liability insurance. Thanks, Maggie. Perhaps the other way, Maggie, be good. Thanks. Wonderful stuff. Professional. Okay, so this is about giving advice. This is about what it is you choose to say, making sure that your statements are indeed evidence-based. This is also, in this world that we live in, being very careful about what you say, particularly about your clients, and what you may or may not share about your experiences in some of the sort of social media sites. You know, I look and participate in certain discussions. I'm asked, like today, I'm very cautious about what I say in terms of any reference to individual clients. And again, when it comes to clinical safety case reports, be aware about copying and pasting and all those other elements from other safety cases that might have been produced by third-party companies where they have invested IP. So again, the professional indemnity insurance is looking to give you some professional cover should any of these eventualities happen. Finally, the last one is, thank you, Maggie, the liability for the product itself. Now, it's interesting when you think about that as a freelance clinical safety officer. I'm essentially producing products. You know, the clinical safety case report is a product. So, and that sort of product then would support health IT. So this element of the insurance is concerned with making sure that those products are indeed fit for purpose, and any issues concerned with lack of due diligence or unforeseen circumstances that arise from the nature of those products. So in summary there, the insurance element for a contractor falls into these three components. So it's all very well telling you about what you need, but I think equally as importantly to share with you is, you know, some common sense thoughts, experiences about how to navigate and behave appropriately. So the next few slides are really given over to that. Thank you, Maggie. So in my work, I work with companies that are either on NHS frameworks, so G-Cloud, G-Cloud Plus, but I also work through personal recommendation and network. So if your work comes through a framework, what I will offer to you in any response that you put together in the form of a proposal is to be very clear about what your aim is, to be very, very clear about the scope of the work that you're offering. And it's generally failure to recognize the significance of scope that can cause you to trip up. There are many cases where, for whatever reason, one didn't clarify the scope properly, and you will find yourself then having to work outside what you thought was scope because it wasn't properly defined, because it drifted. And in some cases, you might be forced to do rework. So as a commercial clinical safety officer contractor, any rework that I do is at my own personal cost, as well as my personal reputation, professional reputation. So I'm very anxious to avoid that. So significantly, I spend a lot of time with my clients around scope. And what I do in my proposals is I add 1 or 2 days discovery. And I actually say, if you want my services before doing anything, you will have to fund a component part around discovery to do with the complexity of what we've been asking you to do. I'm very interested indeed in you know, coming back to what Maggie said about making sure that there's every opportunity to properly look at areas of change and significantly the governance arrangements. So that is, how am I going to report on the activities I do? How do I communicate whether or not they're delivered? Do you want a percentage complete? Do you want a RAG status? How do we deal with escalations? What's the acceptance criteria? And what happens if I go off sick? You know, those are important things that, particularly for a small vendor who only has a finite amount of time, you want to make sure that you have been able to, you know, do the work at the cost that you were prepared to do it, that there was no rework and there was no unintentional confusion or misunderstanding. So that's some ideas about staying on the front foot. If I just expand on some of those, if I may, thank you, Maggie. If staying away from the framework and just sort of contracting, again, here I go, you know, I'm making sure that my reflections are considered. So to the point that Sean mentioned earlier, you know, what's the regulatory position in my piece of work? You know, what's the reference to this piece of technology as it relates to medical devices? So here's an example of the significance that I attach to the plan. Now, some contractors just may only be focused on the safety case from the hazard log. I offer that the plan is actually is a requirement of the DCB, and more importantly, a plan will help protect you against uneventuality. So here you have that scope defined in one section. Who's involved? That's a classic one. You know, I'm a clinical safety officer. To Maggie's point, I'm overseeing that a reasoned, evidence-based argument is put together. So who am I involving? And, you know, what's the transparency? So critical to make sure they're the right people. What's the technique I'm going to use? Different organisations require different techniques. Let's be clear that we use a technique that they might be familiar with, or if they're not, one that we can then build in and get them to understand. And again, you'll see that that's been articulated in the methodology section. And then risk acceptance and tolerability is one that is becoming increasingly interesting. I get the impression the last 10 to 15 years I've been doing this, that trusts are now becoming a little bit more risk adverse, for the right reasons perhaps. So one needs to be very sensitive about how you look at the acceptance criteria when you come to write your safety case up. You know, how do they deal with tolerability? How do they deal with hazards that might be undesirable? Some organisations have existing policies and plans, and I would offer to you that check their risk tolerance and their risk acceptability as a cultural organisation. You know, that's quite important to avoid any unforeseen rework associated with hazards that you thought were acceptable that because of the culture of the organisation are indeed not the case. And again, you know, most organisations do have established likelihood and consequence risk matrix policies, procedures. So check with them. If not, do you know, could they use something else? NHS Digital has one, you know, so I make that point. Thank you, Maggie. So here is a cut and paste around that thing about inclusion and stakeholders. So here's just a page, an example from a safety case that I did last year, and I've just removed some of the comments. The key point I'm making here is when I look to produce these, this is about inclusion. So I want to see that there is an evidence of any changes made. I want to ensure that the products that I produce are reviewed and that the review comments are captured. So great time spent to make sure that the reviewers are appropriate. And for me as a contractor, interestingly, as the clinical safety officer, as I rock up and are tasked to do this work, I generally write the documents and I generally oversee the process that ensures that the culture is such that, you know, all fault and non-fault things are being thought through. So invariably, when it comes to my proposals or my tendering process, I want to make sure that documents are owned within the organisation, because ultimately I'm going to come and I'm going to go. The organisational memory resides in the organisation. So for me, the approval process is so important. So here I just make the point about transparency. Thanks, Maggie. I personally use a log, so I have at any one time, I don't know, between 5, 7, 9 clients where I'm concurrently doing work, different types of work, 129, medical device stuff, work in Europe, work in the UK, it doesn't really matter. The point here is I need to be very conscious that as I'm asking for reward for the work I do, that I can evidence what it is I've done. And this is just an example of how I'd record that. So this is a sheet from a log that shows you that I am doing work. It tells you the activity, what the client is, the deliverables, the area. So this is about planning in this particular case, and then I'm recording the effort. I tend to charge personally in my own company on units of 10 minutes. So different organizations have different things. Again, it's just important. But what I'm showing you here is I am protecting myself against anyone making a claim around insurance. So it's just about protection. And I think, Maggie, the last slide for me is next. And, you know, my final reflections here, there are a number of you on this call that I have worked with collaboratively. Harriet, you and I have done work recently together. So again, I'm just trying to share with you about what it is that I'm evidencing, that I have my own CDP plan or personal development plan. So, you know, here are some things just to get involved with and evidence. And that all helps to reducing your premium cost and evidencing that, you know, as a contractor, you're just deploying good standard governance hygiene. Thank you, Maggie. I think it's your slide now.
Thanks, Clive, for that. Thanks very much, Clive. There are some questions coming in, but Maggie, do you want to just...
So I just want to just reiterate this, and there's lots of really interesting questions coming in. I just want to just to reiterate, we said we want to continue discussion. We're not going to come to a conclusion. I think we are setting the ground rules here ourselves to a certain extent. We do need to concentrate on experience and trust and similar, align with the professional standards SIG, which we started doing, and then more you think about developing and maintain discussion forums, resources and guidance. We've had some discussions about guidance because it sounds like this is the truth as opposed to this is our position and where we are. So we have to do some more thinking about what we publish and what we call it, whether we call it guidance, but we would like to, as from this SIG, come up with our position and what the sum of our thinking is thus far. And we similarly would like to do that to support our members here, but also to make a position statement out into the wider world to help influence national standards. And then on a more prosaic note, we like to actually explore insurance provision. I personally think it's worth going to the MDU and ARCN because they do provide insurance for us, and they need to recognise that as part of their members' employment, they may well be a CSO, and that's part of their clinical role. So we need to go and explore it with them and get a clearer, start thinking about it a bit more widely. But so last thing, the last bit was your thoughts. So that's where we are. Open the conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Maggie and Clive. It's really, really good. I want to just bring in there are some questions. I'm going to try and bring in people by voice because people get bored of my voice. So I've got a couple of things to pick up though. But so can I just, while I organise the chat, Laura, do you want to come in first, Laura?
Yeah, thank you very much. I am the guilty party who submitted that question in the first place.
Thank you.
Very, very much appreciate the effort that you guys have gone to, and also those two presentations today looking at it from both aspects. Obviously, I'm coming from an NHS employee perspective, and I think the big take-home messages for me are ensuring that CSO role and the responsibilities associated with are really, really clearly defined in the job description. And also really interesting what you're saying about that sort of board representation as well. And then also coming back to that sort of final point you made there, Maggie, about other provisions for insurance. One of the other things I went to is, obviously I'm a chartered physiotherapist to trade. I went back to the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, who I have as part of my membership additional cover with. Insurance wise, and actually I am covered as long as I'm working within my scope of practice. So my only issue that I raised with them, and I've started a conversation with them, is that actually the scope of practice documentation for the CSP is very, very clinically based. I don't feel that it's probably up to date with regards to the scope of what physiotherapists are capable of and do now. It's very much based around that classical face-to-face patient relationship. So that's something that I'm certainly going to take back to them, and I think I can probably have a much more informed discussion with them as well with regards to that now that I've listened to what you've had to say today. And hopefully I can maybe even try and make that link. Ewan McComiskey, for instance, is the person who has been, and I know that you guys will know him. So hopefully there's some links to be made there, and also potentially with some of the other professional bodies as well. So big thank you from me. That's been fantastic.
And can I just say from my from that to be a CSO now without that clarity about what the role is and everything does require a bit of courage, if not just being stuck on a shelf that nobody's going to come and rescue from. But my feeling is just write everything down, have it so, because if you went to a court of law, if there was nothing there for them to, there was no framework in which you were working, yet they recognise the value of what you're doing. As long as you could justify what you're doing, so much Caldecott, so much all our professional guidelines, use those things, use IG, use a professional code of conduct, and if you can say I stuck to it, you're almost certainly probably going to be all right. But we are paving the ground rules for the next lot of people coming up behind us. So thank you, Laura, for raising it. It's really,
absolutely.
really
and I was just going to make one little link back there. I have the extreme benefit working as part of Brendan's team alongside Paul, for instance, and others, of, like Brendan said, we work very much as a team sport. And actually, I think then again, with regards to evidence and maintenance of documentation and having others around about you who have also been involved, again, stands you in incredibly good stead for that as well.
Yeah. And thanks, Laura. I was just going to add in, when I phoned up the MDU, they were slightly puzzled about CSOs and didn't quite know how to respond. But they did focus in on kind of areas of professional competence. So and so I think it's a discussion that probably we do need to take forwards with the protection societies, because I don't think they've got a clear grasp. We get many questions coming into NHS Digital around insurance. It's kind of a common theme. Can I want to bring in Brendan, and then I want to come back to a general question about safety case reports. So Brendan, do you want to shout out your question?
Yeah, it was kind of put in the chat. It's a common experience. I mean, I went to the MPS and they kind of scratched their head. So my background is a public health medicine consultant, but I've been a CCIO in this role for 2 years and in Northern Ireland for 9 years before that. But it just, does not compute. The computer says no, so they still have me as a public health medicine consultant. So you can't have sensible discussions with them on this. But it does come back to this wider discussion we're having about what is your competence and scope of practice. And I put earlier in the chat around when Maggie displayed the kind of what is the kind of requirement to be a CSO, and it's an active clinical registration. And I think that's why we've got to be very careful on the risk management in this context. Means something very specific, and that's where you get your protection from, because if you're trained in that and understand that, and if you're employed, it's your organization's responsibility to make sure you follow that. Not that you know the name of the standard that it comes from, but if someone was to come in and ask you, that you could tell them and walk them through the process.
Yeah. Okay, Brendan.
Just respond to that one. I haven't worked clinically as a nurse for over 10 years. I maintain my registration because I have found it extraordinarily easy to re-register against the professional code of conduct using the work I do as a clinical safety officer. So it's not very difficult to do. You just have to have that confidence to do it. I know it's difficult it's different for medics, but I very rarely, when they say what kind of work do you do, as a clinical safety officer, it's not in a drop-down list anywhere, is it? So
no, and for me it's easy because as a public health doc and I'm sort of building population health platforms and so on, that's kind of it's very easy. If it was a frontline clinician, it's harder to revalidate than that, but I'm just talking about that kind of making sure that on your document, and when you say what your day job is, the description for me is public health medicine consultant, which isn't accurate.
And I just want to add in, Brendan, as well, often we have CSOs phoning up, so stating that they've got Crown indemnity, which does apply, but we always advise kind of contacting their MPS, MDU, whatever, for other types of cover that Clive was mentioning, really around legal support if something happens, because Crown indemnity doesn't always cover that. So I think it's up to the CSO to kind of make those inquiries, and if there's, you know, and then sort out the very precise job description as we were discussing as well. Okay, I wanted just to bring in this question around shared safety case reports.
I can answer that, Sebastian. So the question was, as a contractor, about sharing work. So I can only speak for myself, but ethically, if an NHS organisation has paid me to do a piece of work, and I'm going to give you one example. There's a product in mental health called MAST. It's an excellent product. It's a tool that helps prioritise patients at risk of suicide. So many NHS organisations are taking that product. So I have been asked to do that work several times. So rather than charge each organisation the standard amount of days to do the clinical safety work, I have sought the permission of the NHS Trust to which I did that work primarily, and said, could we share it with the trust next door to you? Because whilst they might have a different nuance, the concept, philosophy and understanding this tool, and therefore the associated clinical risk, hold true. And why should the NHS pay any more work when the NHS has already paid for it here? So my answer to the question is, wherever possible, yes. And that goes to the culture of being ethical, but also sharing, transparency, and those discussions we had earlier about culture. And I do think that many of my contractor colleagues probably have the same view. It's about giving something back.
Was it something about any co-created to the NHS belongs to the NHS? So if you got it employed by the NHS, it belongs to the NHS.
Yeah, I think the trouble is, Maggie, these are sovereign organisations, of course, with their own legal statuses. So one has to
yeah, that's an interesting one as well. And I think I would take this view, because there's first of all, if you share 160s, it's a bit like Liverpool Care Pathway. It doesn't survive being lifted and shifted without being re-transformed to that local area. So you can't just lift it and shift it and say, I followed everything that was required by Lincoln, therefore it's going to be all right in Leicestershire. So that will be a real risk, that people say we don't need to employ you to do that thinking, because we're going to just lift and shift it. But the thing that has driven me through my career, and I know I'm a risk taker, but do the right thing. You know, you're employed by the health service, do the right thing. So even if you're a contractor, I'm sorry, I know that's harder to do than others, and I'm really happy to support the coach people who need, and we all need coaching to do the right thing, or a sort of strong friend or friends, and that's the point of this group in a way. But if you know there's a clinical safety risk in something, and you know what needs to be put in place to sort it out, it's your responsibility as a registered clinician, surely, to share that information. And so, but it is a dilemma. It's not a simple black or white. I do understand.
And I think just adding on to that, Maggie, we come from NHS Digital. We do provide templates for safety case reports, but I think the ask is slightly more than that, isn't it? Actually, having some. We've talked about this a lot in the group, in the SIG group, in the steering group, about having a central resource of off-the-shelf documents that can be pulled. But I think, you know, we've always been a bit cautious about that because of the reasons we've just discussed around ownership, who actually owns the documentation. You can't just cut and paste a document into another organisation necessarily. But I think it's something we do need to look at, because the requests are coming through for that, even as a very generic safety case report. So I don't know whether there's kind of enthusiasm from the group here to develop that theme.
I think just on that theme, Sebastian, I'll give you an example of where that could go. So if you look at, let me choose two examples, EPMA or the brave new world of OC. So those are the sort of the online consultation tools. Yeah. There are many different tools and vendors, but they collectively together, they have some inherent risks and benefits. So it's about elevating it. So what you could do is rather than get focused on Teams or Zoom or whatever, or what other vendors, is actually lift that discussion and say, if you're doing clinical safety work in either the 129 or 160 space, because you're looking to deploy online consultation tools, here is the learning experience about 80-20, where the inherent risks be and what it is you can manage it. So I wonder whether or not, looking at some of the chat that's coming through, rather than focus on safety cases and products per se, is say actually you could group those products together.
Yeah, into some general principles.
Yeah,
that would be useful. There's some other comments around organisational risk as different from product risk, I think from Brendan. I think we may have covered that off already. And other things we wanted to talk about. Maggie, from the kind of nursing profession point of view, do you think there's a gap also around the RGN Nursing Midwifery Council around this?
I'll see. But the NMC and the RCN, I certainly think there's an opportunity for the NMC to actually recognise the CSO role as a role that a nurse could take on and enable them to be professionally encourage them to revalidate using that role, be it a full-time role or a part-time role. And I certainly think the RCN, who provides insurance, we need to be talking to them as well. So there's two things. There's the NMC recognising the CSO role as a professional part of nursing, and there's the RCN recognising it as subsequently as something that they need to support people to be doing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We may take that to the nursing professional interest group and see if they want to progress that, or we do it for here. I don't know. But anyway.
And Sebastian, I think ditto for the allied health. Stick a finger up the allied health. I think that the same discussion, the same conceptual elements of the discussion hold true for each of the professional groups that you may engage. Really, I share the same view. When I knocked on my professional body's door, they didn't scratch their head. They closed the door in my face. They just couldn't understand the fact that what's all this about. It was rather disheartening.
Okay. I don't want to see any other general questions from the group really. In the last kind of few minutes we've got. I'm going to close promptly at 2:30, but Maggie.
Sorry, can I just say, is anybody who wants to looking at the work that that Clive and I did about sort of the perspective of the pure contractor and the sort of semi-pure contractor, which is what I was doing. Is there anybody who wants to come and explore those slides we did and from a trust perspective, or from there, if you sort of think, oh, I would want to do it somewhere different in my organisation, do you want to come and join in a conversation and we can sort of work those things up a bit more? Would that be helpful? Anybody wants to do it, get in touch.
So it's always a plea for
plug me into the group. So quite happy to do that from a kind of fully sort of employed in the NHS kind of type role.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so just questions coming through about AI and safety case reports and assistance for CSOs. Yeah, and I think Jan, we do within the faculty we do have an AI group, but we may need something a bit more specific. So we may look at having a session on that, CSO guidance when assessing AI. I somehow don't think we've got there with the standard software at the moment, but I think it's certainly something we need to think about quickly. And there is a University of York session, which I think is on the faculty site, isn't there, Jan?
There is, yes.
Yeah,
last
and
year.
that's
Coming up. Yeah.
Coming up in June. It's a free event at the University of York, run by University of York and NHS Digital. So if you're any of you are interested in that, go onto the faculty website and have a look.
Can I just put another thing out at AI, having been asked to do some clinical safety 0160 for AI? that you need to distinguish between how the AI software system is built, i.e. the 0129, how to interpret it and know what to look for, so you know what standards are being met. And that's a specific thing. And I think if anybody, I think the AI group may want to help develop some of those rules that we're looking for as CSOs, but there's how you are going to use it in your working environment, which is a different thing altogether. Okay, because the piece of work I did turned more into a 0160, how will that information get from one place to another and then go back to the clinician, and how will the clinician interpret it, what the clinician doesn't agree. So there's two bits about it. The AI software as it's designed and how it works and what conclusions it reaches, and then you will need to do an 0160 based on how it will be used in the context in which it's being deployed. So I would make a real plea specifically for AI, because everybody thinks it's just super magic, sexy computers doing very clever things. How will we use it then? And that's more important, or as important as how well it's built or how well it's designed. So those of you out there in your own 160 land, that's really important. How will it work for you in the context you're deploying it?
Thanks very much. So just a quick plea for any volunteers from you out there to come and join us in the Faculty SIG steering group. You know, we're always looking for new ideas for these meetings. The intention is, and I think Jan we'll talk tomorrow about fixing some future dates, is to try and have these every 3 months. I'm getting a lot of calls. This NHS Digital team plus Clive, Maggie, a lot of calls from CSOs which wanting general support, guidance, how they tackle trusts who are not complying, all that sort of stuff. So I think you know, we have a role to play with that, trying to support you all in that. So just wanted to say, you know, do get in touch with the faculty, with Jan. We've got an email address, Jan, haven't we?
Yep.
There. We will be sending a PDF out of these slides. I think that's okay with Clive. We may want to remove certain sections, maybe, but we'll look at that. So we will send you a slide deck. But thanks very much for your questions. But in particular, I wanted to thank our speakers. You know, Sean White from our team. Thanks very much, Sean. Great presentation. Really useful stuff to think about around international standards. And Maggie, thanks very much for your presentation, and also Clive, really helpful. To get, you know, just to start thinking about these areas. As far as I'm aware, there's been no legal case yet on this, but there will be. You know, this will appear at some stage. You know, there will be a legal case versus, you know, patient versus CSO, maybe.
But take heart, because if anybody follows Neil Battier on Discourse, who watches the IG stuff, the cases that come into court from IG are being dealt with as pragmatically as you might have hoped. So unless it's absolutely downright negligence, if you've done things well and you've documented it, they're going that it seems to me that the courts are going to be taking that positively. So show you working out in the margin, and if your trust won't, you know, go back to my point, if your trust doesn't invest in the proper clinical safety activities, they are the ones that own the risk, not you. So it won't be about you.
Okay.
So as long as a CSO, you have a job description, you follow it out and you write it down, I don't think any trouble is going to happen. So
good. Okay, thanks.
And if it does, you'd probably rather work in a garden centre area, wouldn't you?
Yes, right. Thank you very much all. I'm going to close the call, but thanks very much for Jan for holding our hand through all this again, and speak to you soon. We're going to get some dates out for future meetings, but thanks very much for your coordination and cooperation and participation, of course, but speak soon to some of you and take care. Thanks very much.